The salt spray hits your face as rough hands drag you toward the Longship. You are 17 years old, standing on the Irish coast. And this is the last moment of the life you knew. The men who now own you speak words you cannot understand. Their laughter sounds like animals. Your wrists bleed where the rope cuts into your skin. Behind you, your village burns. The smoke chokes the air, stings your eyes. Everything you knew is ash. You are not a person anymore. You are property. Your journey into hell has just begun. This was the Viking Age, late 8th to mid-11th century. We remember the exploration, the warriors, the revolutionary ships. We think of sagas and Longships and Lindisfarne. But behind those heroic tales and the myth of horned helmets they never wore, there's a much darker truth. For hundreds of years, the Norse economy ran on a vast, organized, and brutally efficient trade in human beings. This wasn't a side effect of raiding. It was often the main goal. The most profitable loot was people. What you're about to discover is that for countless women from the British Isles to the Slavic East, the Viking Age was a systematic machine of abduction, dehumanization, and lifelong exploitation. This isn't speculation. This isn't sensationalized. This is reality, reconstructed from the Vikings' own legal codes, from chronicles written by their victims, from archaeological evidence dug from the ground, and from the cold, detailed eyewitness accounts of Arab diplomats who traded with them. But before we continue, if you find value in exploring the unvarnished truths of our past, consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into dark and forgotten history. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin with the system itself, because it was above all a system. The Viking raid, as depicted in popular culture, is often a chaotic, violent outburst. But the historical reality was far more organized. More akin to a predatory business venture than a simple rampage. Raiding parties were investments. A local chieftain or a group of felagar, partners in a commercial enterprise, would pool their resources to build or outfit a longship. This required significant capital: timber, iron for rivets, sailcloth, tar, and provisions. The investors expected a return, and the most valuable, most portable, and most consistently available return on that investment was human cargo. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering, perfectly suited for this purpose. The shallow draft of vessels like the Knarr or the larger Skide meant they could not only cross the open sea, but also navigate far upriver, bypassing coastal defenses and striking deep into unsuspecting territory. A community living 100 miles from the coast could awaken to find longships on their riverbank, with their escape routes cut off. This technological advantage gave the Vikings the element of surprise, a critical component of successful slaving raids. They targeted what historians call soft targets. Monasteries like the famous raid on Iona in 806, which saw 68 monks slain, were prized not just for their silver chalices and embroidered vestments, but for their inhabitants, literate monks and the people from surrounding communities who sought refuge there. The Irish annals of Ulster are replete with entries that are stark in their simplicity, but horrifying in their implications. The entry for 821 AD notes a raid on County Wexford, where Vikings carried off a great host of women into captivity. The phrase, "a great host," appears again and again. This wasn't an anomaly. It was the business model. Once captured, a woman's identity was systematically erased. She was no longer a daughter, a wife, or sister. She was now a thrall, the Old Norse word for slave. The Old Norse language itself reveals the profound dehumanization inherent in this status. Legal texts often referred to thralls in the neuter gender, classifying them alongside livestock as part of a farm's inventory. They were fey, a word that meant both cattle and wealth. In the eyes of Norse law and society, a thrall was no longer a person. She was an object, a piece of property. Her legal rights were non-existent. A master could beat or even kill his thrall with no legal repercussions. According to the Icelandic law code, the Gragas, a thrall's testimony was inadmissible in court. They could not own property of any significant value. They could not enter into a legal marriage. Their children were born into the same status, ensuring the system was self-perpetuating. The life of a free woman was protected by a complex system of fines and honor. The life of a thrall was protected by nothing at all. The journey from her home was the first stage of this new hell. Captives were bound and marched, often for miles, to where the Longships were beached. There they were packed into the open vessels alongside plunder and warriors for a voyage that could last weeks. We must imagine the conditions. Dozens of people crammed into a space, perhaps 70 or 80 feet long, exposed to the harsh North Atlantic weather, soaked by freezing waves with minimal food and water. Disease would have been rampant. The psychological terror unimaginable. Many would not have survived the voyage. For those who did, the destination was often a bustling, terrifying slave market. The Vikings established major hubs for the human trade that formed a vast network across their sphere of influence. Dublin, or Dyflin as the Norse called it, became one of the largest and most notorious slave markets in all of Western Europe. A central clearinghouse for captives seized from across Ireland and Britain. From here, women could be sold to Norse settlers in Ireland, shipped back to Scandinavia, or trafficked to the newly colonized lands of Iceland and the Faroe Islands. But the network extended even further. Major markets also existed in Hedeby on the border of modern-day Germany and Denmark, and in Birka, a trading hub on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden. These eastern-facing ports connected the Norse world to the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. This was the famous Volga trade route, a slaving superhighway that funneled captives from the west and even more so from the Slavic lands of the east, the Sakaliba, as Arab chroniclers called them, down to the Byzantine Empire and the fabulously wealthy Abbasid Caliphate. The sheer volume of this trade is staggering. The 10th century Persian geographer Ibn Rusta described the activities of the Rus, the Norsemen of the East, stating plainly, "They raid the Sakaliba and travel by ship to seize them, and they take them prisoner, and they carry them to Khazaran and Bulgar and trade them there. Captives taken from an English village could be shipped to Dublin, sold to another Norse trader, transported to Birka, sold again, and then forced on a long and arduous journey down the Dnieper or Volga rivers to be sold for a final time in the markets of Constantinople or Baghdad, in exchange for Arab silver and silk." This is not conjecture. The physical evidence is overwhelming. Tens of thousands of Islamic dirham coins have been unearthed in Scandinavia, particularly on the Swedish island of Gotland, a major nexus in this trade network. These silver hoards are the silent metallic proof of the vast commerce between the Norse world and the Caliphate, a commerce whose primary northern export was human beings. At these markets, the final vestiges of a woman's dignity were stripped away. She was treated like an animal. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Rus traders on the Volga, gives a chilling first-hand account that leaves nothing to the imagination. He describes them setting up a market on the riverbank, lining up their captives for sale. He writes that a trader would have intercourse with the slave girl he has, while his companion looks on. He clarifies this wasn't done in private. It was a public act, a demonstration of absolute ownership, a sales tactic. It was a complete negation of the woman's humanity performed in the cold light of day. Her body was a product to be advertised. Once sold, a woman's fate depended on the needs and whims of her new owner. The most common destiny was a life of relentless, grueling labor. As a thrall, she performed the most arduous tasks of the household, the innenhus, or indoor work. She would be the first to rise long before the sun and the last to go to sleep. Her days were a monotonous cycle of grinding grain into flour with a heavy quern stone, a task that would wear down the teeth and strain the back. She would be hauling water from a well or stream, tending the central fire of the longhouse, cooking, brewing ale, and washing clothes by hand in the icy rivers. Another critical task was textile production. Making vadmal, a coarse woolen cloth, was a labor-intensive multi-stage process of shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving. This cloth was a cornerstone of the Norse economy, used for everything from sails and clothing to a form of currency. This entire industry rested on the backs of female thralls. The Old Norse poem Rigstula, which describes the mythological origins of the three social classes, depicts the archetypal thralls as having wrinkled skin, gnarled knuckles, and thick fingers. A poetic but accurate acknowledgement of a life defined by unceasing manual labor. Archaeological evidence from burial sites provides grim confirmation of this hard life. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains from Norse-era cemeteries has shown that individuals buried with fewer grave goods, presumed to be thralls, often had significantly poorer diets than the high-status individuals they were buried near. Their bones show signs of nutritional deficiencies and extreme physical stress, a silent testament to a life of toil and deprivation. Yet for a great many captured women, their exploitation went far beyond labor. They were also objects of sexual servitude. This is a reality often sanitized or ignored in popular retellings of the Viking Age, but one that is undeniable in the historical and archaeological record. Having no legal personhood, a female thrall's body was her owner's property, available for his use at any time, for any purpose. This was not considered a crime. It was a right of ownership. The sagas, while written centuries later and often romanticized, are unambiguous about this societal norm. Powerful men are frequently depicted taking captured women as concubines known in Old Norse as Frilla. These were not secret affairs or illicit relationships. They were a recognized, if unofficial, domestic arrangement. The Laxdæla saga, one of the great Icelandic family sagas, features a central storyline involving an Irish princess named Melkorka. She's captured in a Viking raid, her tongue supposedly cut out to prevent her from speaking. An Icelandic chieftain, Hoskuld Dala Kolsson, buys her at a market in Norway and takes her back to Iceland as his concubine. Though she is a princess by birth and the mother of his favorite son, Olaf Peacock, her status remains that of a slave. The children born from such unions faced a precarious and uncertain future. They were known as Frillubörn, concubine children, and their legal standing was inferior to that of legitimate heirs born to a free wife. A father could choose to acknowledge a child born to a thrall and grant them freedom, but he was under no obligation to do so. He could just as easily refuse, condemning his own offspring to a life of slavery. This practice created complex and often tense social dynamics within the longhouse, where a freeborn wife, the mistress of the household, had to coexist with the enslaved women her husband used as concubines. This system of sexual exploitation was so widespread and so foundational to the settlement of new territories that it has left a permanent, indelible mark on the genetic landscape of the North Atlantic. Modern genetic studies conducted in Iceland, one of the best documented Viking Age colonies, have produced a startling and powerful revelation. Analysis of the modern Icelandic population shows that while the majority of the male line settlers' Y chromosome DNA is of Norse origin, around 80%, The majority of the female line settlers' mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down exclusively from mother to child, is of Gaelic origin from Ireland and Scotland. The most recent studies place this figure at over 62%. The numbers are stark, and they tell a clear, unambiguous story. The founding of Iceland was largely accomplished by Norse men bringing Gaelic women with them. Given the historical context of relentless Viking raiding in the British Isles throughout this period, it is impossible to conclude that the majority of these women came as willing wives or partners. They were the founding mothers of a new nation, but they were brought there in chains. Their DNA, carried by Icelanders to this day, is the silent, irrefutable scientific evidence of a massive gendered migration built on abduction and sexual slavery. For a very small minority of captured women, a different fate awaited them. If a woman was of demonstrably high birth, a princess, a noblewoman, the wife or daughter of a king, she might be seen as more valuable for ransom than for labor or concubinage. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources document instances where Viking chieftains would hold high-status women and churchmen captive to extort massive payments of silver, gold, and land from their families or kingdoms. These women became political pawns, their lives and freedom a form of currency in the high-stakes diplomacy and warfare of the age. Their ordeal was one of terrifying uncertainty, held as bargaining chips by the very men who had slaughtered their kin and burned their homes. But there was one final horrific fate that could befall a captured woman, one that stands as a testament to the brutal intersection of religion, power, and violence in Norse pagan culture. Archaeological and textual sources confirm that human sacrifice was practiced, and female thralls were sometimes the chosen victims. The most vivid, detailed, and deeply disturbing account comes again from the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In the year 922, while traveling along the Volga River, he witnessed the ship burial of a great Rus chieftain. He describes how, as part of the funerary rites, a female slave had to volunteer to die with her master and serve him in the afterlife. The concept of her volunteering is, of course, a fiction. As a thrall, she had no choice. Ibn Fadlan's account details a 10-day process of ritual preparation. The chosen girl was dressed in fine clothes, plied with intoxicating drinks, and made to sing, though he notes her songs were sad. She was passed from tent to tent where the chieftain's most powerful men would have ritualized sexual intercourse with her. Each man would tell her, "Tell your lord, I have done this out of love for him." On the 10th day, the chieftain's body was laid out on his ship, which had been hauled ashore. The girl was brought to the vessel. She was given a final potent drink and then led onto the ship by an old woman, a ritual executioner known as the Angel of Death. She was laid down next to her dead master. The Angel of Death placed a rope around her neck, giving the ends to two men to pull. As the men strangled her, the old woman repeatedly stabbed her between the ribs with a broad-bladed dagger. Ibn Fadlan reports that her cries were deliberately drowned out by the other men, beating loudly on their shields, a terrifyingly practical precaution taken so that other slave girls would not become frightened and seek to escape death when their masters died. Finally, the ship was set ablaze, becoming a floating pyre to carry the chieftain and his murdered servant to the next world. While Ibn Fadlan's account is uniquely graphic, it is not an isolated fantasy. It is corroborated by archaeological finds. Graves have been discovered across the Viking world that point to the practice of retainer sacrifice. At Flakstad in Norway, a grave contained multiple bodies, where some individuals, including a decapitated man, are clearly buried as secondary figures to a high-status woman. At the famous Oseberg ship burial, two women were interred. One, an older high-status noblewoman, the other, a younger woman, whose skeletal analysis suggests a harder life and lower status. Many scholars believe she was a thrall sacrificed to accompany her mistress. The evidence is clear. For a captured woman, her life could end not just in servitude, but as the final bloody property of a powerful owner, a grave good for their journey into the afterlife. The cultural normalization of this brutality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. In Norse society, owning thralls was a fundamental mark of status and wealth. A powerful man's standing was measured not just in land and silver, but in the number of unfree people he commanded. The sagas, the great literature of this people, portray slavery not as a moral failing or a societal evil, but as a simple, unquestioned fact of life. It was a foundational pillar of their social and economic order. This wasn't a society wrestling with the morality of its actions. It was a society built on a bedrock of exploitation that was considered entirely normal. There were avenues to freedom, but they were narrow, steep, and rare. The process of freeing a slave was called manumission. An owner could grant a thrall freedom, perhaps as a reward for long and loyal service or in their will. The Herning runestone in Denmark was raised by a man named Toki the blacksmith in memory of his former master Thor Geisel, who gave him both gold and freedom. But these stories stand out precisely because they were the exception. For the overwhelming majority of captured women, enslavement was a life sentence, a sentence that would be passed down to her children. The eventual decline of this system was slow and complex. The official conversion of the Scandinavian kingdoms to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries played a role. The Church officially discouraged the enslavement of fellow Christians, which didn't end slavery, but rather shifted its focus. Viking raids for slaves increasingly targeted the still pagan Slavic and Baltic peoples. Over time, the chattel slavery of the Viking Age gradually transformed into the tide serfdom of medieval feudalism. But for centuries, the system flourished. What the Viking Age reveals is a stark and uncomfortable truth about how systems of exploitation function. The abduction and enslavement of women wasn't merely the random acts of monstrous individuals. It was an economic engine. It was a tool of social advancement. It was a culturally sanctioned institution that underpinned the Viking world's expansion, colonization, and prosperity. The silver that flowed into Scandinavia, the great halls that were built, the voyages of exploration to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, all were financed and made possible in part by the stolen lives and bodies of women. When we look at the Viking Age, it is crucial to see it in its totality. We must see the master shipbuilders, but we must also see the women whose forced labor produced the sails for their ships. We must see the fierce warriors, but we must also see the terrified girls they dragged onto their longships. We must admire the sagas as great works of world literature, but we must also read between the lines to see the casual, unthinking brutality they normalized. The story of what Vikings did to captured women is more than just a dark chapter in history. It's a fundamental case study in dehumanization. It shows how easily a society can come to see other human beings as commodities, as tools, as things to be used, traded, and discarded. The evidence is overwhelming and clear, written in the annals of their victims, in the legal codes of the perpetrators, in the DNA of modern populations, and in the bones buried in the earth. The romantic image of the Viking warrior, free and untamed, is a fiction built upon the unfree and the brutally tamed. The true legacy of this era is written not just in runes, but in the silent, harrowing, and largely forgotten stories of the countless women whose lives were stolen to build it. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.